Just throwing together a video here for a question that comes up quite frequently on some of the forums and the Facebook pages for the Bluebirds about fitting an SR20 into it from a 2-litre Primera or any other variations of those. So seeing that I have the conversion done, I decided I'd throw a list together of a few of the main topics that do come up quite frequently and what you're going to need to think about and what you're going to have to, I suppose, what you're going to come up against in actually completing this conversion. Took me some time to do. It actually took me about a winter because, well, I wasn't really rushing at it and there was a few things I wanted to do quite specifically. It's not difficult, it's pretty straightforward, I will say that, but there's a few considerations that need to be thought about, stuff that I didn't think about before starting out with this, so that's what I'm going to kind of touch on in this video. So I have my David Freiberger style cardboard here to talk through just, I suppose, the main points, just as a reminder to myself, I suppose, of getting through. And I'm going to go through all of these individually anyway in a minute and move the camera around and so you can see what's going on. So first and foremost, actually mounting the engine in there. So when you have an SR20 from, let's say, a Primera, most commonly where you're going to get them from, front-wheel drive variation, you're obviously going to want to worry about obviously mounting it into the engine itself, or into the engine bay. Now, thankfully, the engine mounts on this being a 1.6 petrol. We have both the front engine mount here by cylinder 1 and the gearbox mount where they actually go to the legs of the car. The drive shaft sits straight in, so there's absolutely no problem there. What you need to think about really is the cross member that goes down obviously underneath. You can't use the original one from the GA or the LD20 series engines in these because they're going to be getting in the way of the exhaust. So you do need to use the Primera cross member, as that's kind of more centralized and you need to reroute the exhaust as well. So that's one thing we're going to talk about. Second thing we're going to be talking about is drive shafts. Pretty straightforward. Again, the drive shafts, what you can do is, well, this is a bit different because I have an LSD gearbox in it from an SR16 VE from a Pulsar VZR. But the drive shafts are still the same-ish lengthwise. So basically you're still just using Primera drive shafts, so there's no problems there. Clutch, again we'll touch about that in a second. You're just using the standard Bluebird clutch linkage, just use it on the cable. So that's the one thing actually, yeah. So the 1.6s came with a cable, and I think the diesels did as well, but if you have a 1.8 or 2-litre GA series, I believe they came with hydraulic. So if you're using a Primera gearbox, which is going to be the SR20 gearbox, which you have to use, you're going to have to convert the gearbox to cable unless you really want to go messing around with it. I didn't want to go there, I had that already, so all I had to do was use that bracket, or use the bracket from the SR20 gearbox for the actual linkage on the gearbox, but use the cable from the GA16, which was fine. Gear linkage as well, so you're still going to need to be able to shift gears, of course. Not too much hassle here. You will need to slightly extend out the gear linkage. I'll talk about that in a second. Again, power steering, you can't use one of the steering hoses as they end up in different locations, so the high pressure feed. Not too complicated. You do have to get a custom feed made. I'll show you that in a moment. Fuel, of course, you obviously need to get high pressure fuel line up. There's absolutely nothing in the petrol tank at all. It used to be a pump on the GA series engines, so you're going to need to get a high pressure fuel pump solution, like a swirl pot like what I have. Wiring up the ECU and loom, again quite straightforward actually. That was a big learning curve for myself. We'll go through that in a moment anyway. The clocks, so what you need to do to get the actual, the dash up and running so you can have all of your gauges on the go. Actually quite straightforward in relation to the clocks. And exhaust, not too much there. You will need to reroute it. I got one of those eBay cheap manifolds for mine, had to bend it in a little bit just so to clear the anti-roll bar there on the front. So that's really it. So for what the main points really is to what you're going to need to consider as you're going through. So I'm going to take the camera now, we're going to go through and I'll show you the bits and bobs anyway, individually anyway there, okay? So yeah, okay, here we go. Okay, so engine mounts. Firstly, well, here's my SR20 anyway, and mine's the high port out of a early EZX Primera, I do believe it was. Just to go down through the list anyway here, so the first thing we're talking about anyway is going to be the engine mounts, okay? So basically, here's your engine mounts. This is where they're going to mount on. What we have here, this is just the standard engine mount that actually came with that engine, okay? And it mounts directly into this bracket. This is originally from the Bluebird itself, so from the T72. That goes straight in, not a problem, straight in to that one there. Just make sure, again, make sure it's a Primera mount. A Almira one won't work on this side. So the next one then is the gearbox mount. So if you have a look under the battery here, this is where it's going to get a little bit complicated, and a friend of mine as well been having a little bit of chat about this. So this is the setup, again, from this bracket. This one here is the standard from the T72. And then we have this mount here, which is the one from the P10 Primera. So if you're getting a P10 Primera, you're pretty much going to be okay here. You might need to locate the actual bracket that bolts onto the chassis leg. It's just 4 bolts that bolt straight into the chassis leg, and away you go. If you're getting a P11 gearbox, you're going to have a little bit more difficulty with this. The P11 gearbox mounts differently. It bolts on using these studs here, and a mount comes up here, so it's going to mount back here. I'm not sure, there might be a method or a bracket or something like that that you can use, but I haven't come across it anyway myself. I've been recommending to try get a P10 mount if possible. Now this is actually from a 1.6 rather than the 2 litre. So from a GA16 gearbox, and I can absolutely 100% confirm that. All I needed to do was narrow down the little bar that goes in there by about like 5 millimeters, and it's absolutely fine. So yeah, there's that, and then there's the cross member. So here's the P10 cross member. So the original GA one would have gone along here. However, the P10 one goes here. Now, in order to bolt it up, I just drill 2 holes, put a plate in there, and away you go. You can just mount that up there. Then I have some polyurethane mounts, that's all well and good. And all of that just sits into place. However, you're gonna need to take into consideration, I'm gonna try my best here now to get this down in here. No, it's not really gonna work. But anyway, the tunnel lines up basically where we're trying to get in with the mount. If I can zoom in here. Yeah, you're kind of seeing it there. It's really bad though. So basically, there isn't really a way that you can just bolt in the back of the cross member. So you need to fabricate a bracket. And I have an example of what I've done here. Okay, so again, the original one would have kind of come in over here. We're now lining up here, and that's where the exhaust used to run. So what I've done was, here's actually an example of a bracket that I was working on. This is a bracket that I had to make up. So now those bolts are just loosely on there, okay, but just as an idea. So basically, here's the bracket that I had to make. These holes go into the bottom of the power steering bracket, okay? And then I put in 2 of these, obviously I drilled them out, and I used them then where I could mount in the cross member. So that if you can imagine, that's being kind of mounted up at the top of the tunnel. And I'll try link in some photos with this as well if I still have some. And yeah, it just came up and it bolted in straight into that there, kind of like it would have done in the Primera. Now, I know you might be asking, maybe this power steering doesn't seem really appropriate, or not the power steering, but the steering rack brackets may seem quite flimsy. Yeah, you're right, I did think about that. And what I had done, again, I'll try to get some photos in as well, was I made a bracket coming from here down the way as well. So it kind of elongates down and sits on top of where the other cross member would have done with some angle iron. So that really reinforces it quite a bit. So most of the pressure is going to be given there rather than, this is just more keeping them in line, whereas all the force really will be going down onto that other bracket. Okay. Next on the list, we've drive shafts. So as I was saying, drive shafts, if you have a donor car, like let's say a scrapped P11 or P10, whatever the case may be, you're going to be pretty much okay here. What I done was, I used, before, because my previous gearbox gave out, 5th gear gave out on me, so I just had to get a replacement box. Turned out it was an LSD box, but you can still just use the Primera drive shafts. So I'm using a P11 drive shaft this side, the driver's side. Let's see if we can kind of see down. No, I won't be able to see down to it, but it's a P11 drive shaft down there. You can just about just about see it. Just there. Yeah, very basic anyway. You just use that bracket. It has like an angled bracket just at the back of the engine there as well, so it takes the obviously the drive and put it out to the wheel. It fits up to the hub there, absolutely no problem. You're going to be good with that. And while we're here as well, you can just see it, talking about the clutch. So here's the original clutch cable, coming obviously from within the bulkhead. That never had to go away. So that's coming around, and that's mounting up onto this bracket here, and this bracket is just the factory one from the SR20. So when you put it on there, and in fact I need to tighten that up, never noticed that, haven't driven the car all winter. So yeah, you can just put that in then, and that works absolutely perfectly fine. All right, it's going to be the gear linkage. So the gear linkage I used again from a P10. You can use the GA one, but I found it to be quite sloppy. So P10 one, especially when you get I have a little poly bush as well mounted up at the actual gearbox itself. But it works perfectly fine. I'll just demonstrate now. So this is how my one sits. It's fine. It absolutely works. A little bit maybe lopsided, but you know, that's neither here nor there, doesn't matter. It goes absolutely fine between the gears. It feels nice and good. It's a nice solid feel. I really like it. There's no problems with it at all. So that's it. So if you're going about, I would recommend to use the P10 shifter. It does bring it down a little bit, so it makes it feel, I guess, a little bit more sporty, because the other one I remember was a little bit high and very sloppy. So yeah, that's a nice little upgrade as well. And it's probably the easier way to go about it, because the GA linkage does not fit up to the the CA linkage, the CA16 or the LD20 do not match up with the Primera ones basically. So they're not the same gates or whatever, I don't know the technical term for it. So yeah, basically what I had to do was to use that. The only thing, in order to get it to line up basically where it sits now, is it would have been sitting a little bit more forward, and it wasn't really going to work out. You would have been hitting the radio when you're trying to change gears. So what you have to do, just to use the standard shifter, or to use this shifter, is you need to extend. Now you're going to have to measure it yourself, but from memory, this is over 2 years ago now nearly, where I think it was 35 millimeters that I just had to chop out of it and add in a section of 35 millimeters into the actual linkage itself. So just cut it in with a bit of 35 millimeter, and it pretty much ends up here. The only other thing then is the little rubber mount at the back of it. What you need to do is, I believe, again just guessing on the measurements here, but let's say the bolts that did go through, they were like 60 millimeters apart. I just had to widen out to like reach drill it or something to 70 mil. Very straightforward, very simple to do. Can't do that now because of all the heat shields and whatnot in the way, so I'm not going to that extent, but you'll see exactly what I mean anyway if you're taking on this job. But yeah, so that's the gear linkage anyway, and it works absolutely fine. It's never let me down anyway. So the next one, power steering. Yes, you can use again the SR equipment. There's no problems with that. In fact, my power steering pump there is actually from a P11. So yeah, you can kind of wiggle them around and whatnot. That's not a problem. Basically, everything else is pretty much factory. So this is all the standard Bluebird stuff. That's not an issue. Just the coolant pipes there. And the original one sits up and in here. I did relocate mine just to here as I was trying to eliminate a bit of a noise, but you can see it's just to kind of get a good run straight down in, if you follow this black pipe down, to get a straight run into the actual power steering pump itself, which is there, because it sounded like it wasn't getting enough fluid. It is, it's getting plenty. I don't know what the story is, it just seems to be just noisy for one reason or another. Not too worried about it. But yeah, so that's actually just the P10 power steering reservoir. Yeah, you can do that. You can still use the original CA one or the original Bluebird one from up here, and it is kind of awkward to try get the lines down in underneath the brake reservoir and whatnot. So, or the brake master cylinder, I should say. But yeah, you know, if you can figure that out, go for it. Whatever suits yourself anyway as you're going through it. Now, the other thing then, I guess, is the actual power steering line. Getting it from here and getting it onto, if you can see it down here, yeah. So if you can see it, that there, that's where it matches up to the power steering rack. And if you see this bit of silver shiny stuff just here, that's the new hose that I had to get made up.
Literally all it is, it's two banjo ends essentially with some, I think it's like 16 millimeters. Oh no, there it is. In fact, you can see this bit of a hose down here. Yeah, just there, kind of with 21 and 7 on it. Yeah, literally just that, with a banjo end on both sides on the flat plane. And I think they were like 13 centimeter or inches, I should say, apart, just to give it a bit of flexibility for the engine actually going through there. Works fine. I haven't had a single problem with it. It's been quite flawless. So yeah, you just get a local hose placed to make up that. Obviously it needs to be very high pressure for power steering. That hose anyway is more than double rated what power steering is rated at anyway, so there's no problems with that. Just before I forget as well, I know I forgot to include it on the list here, but it's cooling. I'm using that's a aluminium radiator for a P10, but just a P10 radiator is perfectly fine. P10 hoses here, actually I think P11 or something like that. They're all just the factory hoses. I did just need to make up these little brackets. I do want to replace them with the rubber mounts instead. I make up a mount as well for the bottom, but it fits absolutely perfectly fine in there. There's no problems with this. Cooling isn't an issue at all. So yeah, and even at that, I believe that's the factory loom then that just comes in, so it's still nice and tidy. Okay, the next one is fuel. So here's what I want to talk about with fuel. Obviously the 1.6 was carbureted. Most of these were carbureted. So if you're going using, obviously the SR20 is going to be fuel injected. So you're going to need to come up with a solution to get high pressure fuel up to the rail. Now, once you can figure it out, I'm still just using the factory fuel rail and the free fuel pressure regulator. You don't need anything fancy. It works fine, no problems at all. If you're lucky enough and you have a fuel injected model of a T12, T72, whatever it is you're working on, then go ahead and use the in-tank fuel pump. You don't have that option unless you get a tank or something like that, so you can retrofit it. Fit the whole tank over, but the hole at the top of the tank, essentially where the fuel pump would go in the carbureted models, there's only enough room for the sensor, the fuel level sensor. You can't, unless you really want to go heavily modifying the fuel tank or anything like that. I didn't want to bother doing anything like that. So what I had done as a solution instead, I took out the fuel tank, I cleaned it all up and I made sure it was rust free, blah blah blah, and made it nice and safe. But what I done instead was I fitted a swirl pot into my own, and it's on 2 switches. So we have a nice slow or low pressure fuel pump from the tank into the swirl pot. I'll show you it all now in a second. And then high pressure from the swirl pot up to the fuel rail itself. So click on both. Well, put them both out there for a second and let you hear. So they are quite loud. Turn off the radio. So here's the low pressure, little clacky sort of a one. So if you can hear it, that's just low pressure sucking fuel from the main tank and putting it into the swirl pot. And then I'll just introduce in the high pressure. It's a Bosch 044 knockoff, and it works perfectly fine. So it does. It's no problems at all. Haven't run out of fuel or anything like that, so it's all good. So I'm going to have a look at that there now anyway. So turn that off for a second. So here it is anyway in the boot. So here's my swirl pot. See if we can get into that light. Perfect. So here's my swirl pot that, again, this is just off of eBay. It was nice and cheap. Same with all the fittings and whatnot. So what I done, and I'll show you the wiring again in a second, okay? But coming up here, I have my Bosch 044 knockoff fuel pump in here, sending a high pressure feed, brand new aluminium 3/8 line all the way up to in front of the firewall. We have a return, I don't know which is which now, but we have a return then as well from the bulkhead, from the engine and the fuel rail coming back. Then we also have the feed. One of these would be the feed as well from the actual fuel tank. And again, just a feed, because when this fills up, it needs to go back somewhere, so it then just feeds back to the actual fuel tank itself. It works perfectly fine, and I'll see if I can show you now. Underneath. So there is my little fuel pump. So that's the little light one, the low pressure fuel line essentially, or fuel pump from the tank. It's very clacky, it is quite loud. I do want to replace it at some stage, but it's working perfectly fine. It's doing what it needs to do. So that's it. So I'll just turn them both back on. Let you hear what they sound like. So this is them running just off the battery. So it is quite loud. So there's the squirrel pot. This Bosch 044, and the clack then is the one from underneath. Let you hear that now. Feed up then from down below or from behind. This is where the lines come up then, and just then feed up and into the fuel filter and up to the fuel rail. Pretty straightforward then after that. Works fine, never had a problem with it. So yeah, I do recommend that solution. It is good. You have to be very careful if you are going to run like an external high pressure fuel pump to the tank. I don't recommend that, quite frankly, because you're really going to have to make sure that the car is kept fully topped up with petrol. Because if a high pressure fuel pump with an internal coolant or whatever the internal feed in it is, it can really destroy the pump very quickly. So you want to be very careful with the likes of that. Mine is left submerged, it consistently has fuel, it's not going to run dry with the swirl pot, so it's a really good recommendation there. Alright, so coming back to the list. Next up is the ECU and the loom. So you're definitely going to need to make sure that you have the loom from the SR20, okay, from whatever car it is that you're going with. The ECU, this was this is a very early engine, early iteration of the whole thing, so there was no NATs or anything like that that I had to deal with. Made it quite straightforward, just fit it in. I just had to fit an aftermarket alarm with it as well to make sure it's nice and safe. So there's no NATs to deal with. If you have an ECU that has NATs, you're either going to need to transfer the whole NATs system, or look, I have no experience with it, but I do hear rumors that there's people out there that can remove the NATs. You send off your ECU, they can remove the NATs, and what they'll do is they will, you can unlock it then and away you go. So what I had done, my ECU, I have mine wired up. All my wires kind of feeding through there. Might be able to see it, but just underneath the glove box there. But there's a metal plate behind the glove box. This one here. You can see that, and that's where mine is actually mounted. Is on the other side of that. There is room. It's working fine. It's not interfering with the heater matrix or anything like that. So yeah, that's a good idea there. All the wires come through. Make sure, obviously, that you wire everything and you know exactly what you're doing with the wiring. If you don't know about it, just have someone else do it. I really had to figure out a lot for it. But with my own ECU, just to speak about it lightly, there was basically 3 wires I needed to wire up to it, I believe, in which to get it running. You'd have the ignition. So obviously when you turn on the key, you're going to have a continuous power feed from the battery, a start signal. Actually, it's 4. Yeah, the start signal needs to go to it, and the last one then is the fuel pump. So once it's getting power from each of those, then it's fine. They're like the 4 inputs to it in which to make the ECU actually run. You do definitely need the start signal. I actually just took it straight from the nice thick wires inside in there. It's not going to throw current or any extra current over to the ECU. It's just all going to be 12 volts. So once it gets its, on or off signal, it's fine. Now, in relation to the wiring, again, as I say, I have some ignition. So obviously we have the factory stuff here, and you can use that, and I did use that for a few bits and bobs with the ECU. But what I also done was I brought over from a P10, I had this little box here, so I fitted that again, just kind of making it look a little bit factory. And all my wires come through like this there for grounded points. And if I can get this open now. So yeah, this is the little distribution box then that I got. So we have the relays here for the fuel pumps and fuses and whatnot then as well. So it's, all as good as can be basically. And I did take a feed as well from, so this is the consistent live feed as well from the battery as well, comes here. And branches off then based on ignition on as well then, so to get it all going. Yeah, So that's the wiring. I'll try link or upload, basically I have images if you need them from the Haynes manual, some wiring diagrams. I have them from the P10 loom, so look, what I'll do is I'll just try scan them in or something, and I'll just try to leave it in the description below. Again, some of this is, that's basically all P10 wiring loom there, so that goes obviously down to the starter. You have some of these white feeds, then these are all original cables for the T72. Some of them then as well, these, I think these double ones as well as part of the SR20 loom. What else? Yeah, but basically there's not too much coming out of the loom that needs to be included in. The only other thing then is your signal for the clocks, and I'm going to show you that then in a second separately. So the next thing you want to make work, all of these, your clocks. So you want to make sure that you have, you know, fuel is obviously going to be untouched. Speedo I did speak about a second ago, so we have the tacho then as well, needs to be included, and we also have the temperature sensor as well. So some of the stuff is going to be pretty standard, like your high beam and all that, that doesn't get touched. The only other light then that we have is going to be the oil light. I didn't do anything there. Instead what I done was I actually just ran gauges, so I have a more accurate measurement as to what it is. So yeah, and I kind of like those because they look, you know, somewhat similar to the factory spec. So and they glow orange as well, which is nice and cool. So talking about the fuel gauge, or no, talking about the, let's start with the speedo drive itself. So this is a mechanical speedo drive, and what it'll do is that has to go onto your gearbox. So what happens, you'll see, I believe it's this one here. Essentially, yeah, so that comes out, it goes down and around, blah, blah, blah. And it feeds down to your gearbox in there. So you screw that on, you line up the pins, you screw it on, it'll focus. And when you screw that on, then that's it. Just to add in here, if you're using a later SR20 gearbox, it's likely to come with an electronic sensor. You're going to have to source one from an earlier SR20 manual gearbox in around 96 or earlier and swap it over. I had to do that with this gearbox, and as you can see I had to use some washers as they broke, or the sensor broke on the way out of the P10 gearbox that I already had. They are fragile, just be careful and use lots of WD-40. So the next one, and the next two even, right? So the next one really here is going to be the tacho. So this took me a little bit of figuring out, but I got it in the end. Basically with the carbureted engines, how the tacho works is it takes a feed from the negative side of the coil. So if you can kind of imagine a positive and negative feed going into the coil pack, well, what you do is you kind of branch off the negative of the coil and take it just to the straight to the clock, essentially, is all you need to do. And it works. And again, when I've done that, so it's coming from, and I'll show you now, the plug, right? So there's the feed. So you have the positive, whichever one it is here, I believe it's the left one. And essentially what you do is, that's fine, leave that one alone. And then you have the negative. So you have the feed from the negative, branch into it, just literally just tap straight off of it, there's no problems with that. And bring a wire up. So I made this removable just for future servicing and whatnot, and I just joined it straight on. You'll see it there. Bring it out another bit. So that cable straight, it's obviously in shielding, and it just attaches straight up to where the old one was. So there's the old plugs that would have went to the carburetor. So, and that wire that's joined into there is just straight into the tachometer, and that works perfectly fine. Again, this revving to 7,500 RPM, it stays absolutely perfect the whole way up to the 7,500 revs. It's bang on accurate. Speaking of it as well, throttle cable, no problems there at all. Just use the standard GA16 throttle cable. Actually, that cable itself, the actual outer sheathing, I should say, is from the GA series. This cable I just picked up. I don't know what it's from. I actually do think it's off of a GA16 or something. But basically it's a super long cable, so what I've done is I just brought it in, fed it up to the accelerator pedal, and I what do you call it, just kind of put a clamp on it, like a little stay clamp on it, a couple of them actually, then just to make sure that it works. And absolutely no problems with it at all, so it works perfectly fine. Then the last bit of the clocks is going to be your temperature sensor, which connects up just in here. So there's 2 wires. So you see the black one on the left here, well they're both black, but there's this thinner one and then there's a thicker one here. So the thicker one goes to the ECU, this thinner one here then goes to the clock. It's just, in fact I believe it's the same temperature sensor that actually goes in. That's from, I think I actually took that out of the GA series engine, or the CA series engine I should say, and put it straight in. I think it actually fit, and yeah, it works perfectly fine. I have my temperature up on the inside then as well, so there's no problems with that. So, the last one really to talk about is the exhaust. That's pretty straightforward. Like again, if you're tackling this job, you're obviously going to know a bit about it. So like, here's my eBay manifold. It works perfectly fine, as I was saying. It goes down. The only thing is that's going to interfere with where the original cross member would have been, so you can't use it. So that goes down and goes towards the back of the engine, and you can see it there. Zoom in on it. Yeah, just obviously the bit of thick pipe there. And I just had to crush it a small bit. It's obviously not affecting any flow or anything like that, but just where it actually goes up and over the anti-roll bar, just to make sure that it actually fits. And when it does actually fit in, then you're going to have to kind of fabricate in a bit of pipe yourself anyway, just to make sure it all fits up. Like I still need to replace the exhaust on this. I just have a center section cherry bomb, I have a rear cherry bomb, and I'm using the old original piping then in between, so it's rotten out. I really need to replace it. So that's really it. Other than that, I suppose there's not really much else of an overview I can give. Look, if there's any questions, pop them in the comments, or just again the Bluebird owners group or anything along those lines on Facebook. It'll always help to answer out any questions if there is any. Okay, I'll start it up and we'll take it out for a quick spin. It might struggle, it's been parked up pretty much all winter, but we'll see how it goes. Doesn't like idling when it's cold, but we have fuel pressure. Oil pressure, I should say. It's always kind of done that. I think it's actually just one of the sensors that I never wired up. I couldn't figure it out, if I'm honest, so I just didn't bother, but when it gets warm, there's never any problem with it. I'm never really in a rush to drive the car, so I don't mind it warming up a bit first. Alright, I get it up to temperature anyway, take it out for a spin, and we'll see how it performs. A bit of a walk around of it now that it's outside. Again, it has been in the garage all winter, so it's a bit dirty. It has gotten washed alright, but not too bothered with it. 190,000 miles up on the car. I've done pretty much everything to it really, bar the exhaust is the next thing on it that I need to sort. That's blowing like mad. Other than that, no, she's running really strong. But yeah, love the car. It's a lot of fun to drive. Okay, so to conclude, just took it out for a spin there anyway. It was kind of bad road and needed my hand to steer rather than crash, so sorry about that shaky bit of video there. But to conclude, if you can do it, if you have the resources, or if, you know, if it's something that you're interested in doing, absolutely go ahead and do it. I highly recommend it. The car is nice and light, the engine can be
Nice and strong as well, especially if you get a good one. A lot of fun basically to drive. Few points of note though. Now this one does have a few supporting mods as well. I do have a lightweight flywheel in it, and I have some lightweight pulleys in it as well, unorthodox resin pulleys. They really help, and obviously the short ratio box. So they really do help it feel very alive, I guess, I suppose, as it's driving. As well as replace shocks and springs, bushes as well, also done to the car. So there's quite a bit there as well to help it out and really make it kind of feel alive. Yeah, the only other thing really is I would like to, and I do intend to at some stage, is to go ahead and actually completely manufacture a cross member entirely along with the two engine mounts. And the reason for that being is the fact of the way I have it mounted, the engine isn't really at the angle it's supposed to be at. And I'm still not 100% sure whether or not it's just because the way the engine is mounted in, it's just going to be vibrating, or whether there is actually a binding. But I'm kind of feeling that because the engine is a little bit more forward over the front axle, shall we say, than the Primera chassis, that it's binding up on this side as I'm kind of turning, as I'm locking to the right. I've had a look, it seems like there's enough room there for it to be working. You know, I can't really see why it'd be binding up, but there is a kind of a click or a clunk or something like that when going around bends and whatnot. So, you know, if you're taking a sharp right turn or just pulling out of a parking space or something. So I do want to try and remanufacture it to get it at the right angle. I will make that recommendation to maybe try a little bit better than myself in relation to getting it mounted at that correct angle firstly. That's about it really. Other than that, go for it. Any questions, pop them in the comments there, and yeah, I'd be glad to help any way I can. Cheers.